Senator from Utah.
I ask unanimous consent for Number 12 be
Without objection.
Mr. President, I stand on the floor of the Senate today to speak on an issue that's very important to me. The immediate subject that I'm going to address has to do with an amendment that I proposed to our pending patent reform legislation. This amendment calls upon the Senate to get the sense of the Senate that it's the sense of this body that we need a balanced budget amendment to the U.S. Constitution. As I've prepared for this day, I've reviewed the maiden speeches of a number of senators who have served in this august body. And I've seen a consistent theme in maiden speeches that have been given over the course of the last 50 or 60 years. Over and over and over again, they address issues that relate to spending. These issues have spilled over Congress after Congress after Congress until the point that we reach today, the point at which our national debt stands at an astounding figure, close to $15 trillion. As I like to say, $15 trillion is a lot of money. A lot of people don't make $15 trillion in a whole year. And even when you divide $15 trillion by 300 million Americans, you're left with a figure of about $50,000 a head. This is not an inconsequential number. This is not a problem that any of us created. It's a problem that each of us inherited. And yet it's a problem that I think none of us wants to leave to our successor. It's a problem that I think requires us to do something different than we've done in the past. And by this I mean I think we need procedural, structural, and indeed constitutional reform. We need to put Congress in a straitjacket because we've been unwilling or unable in the past to make the kinds of difficult spending decisions that have to be made. In the past, there has been a great debate between, on the one hand, some Republicans who have been unwilling to cut some programs, to consider in any context cuts in the area of, say, national defense. You've had others who perhaps from the other party have been unwilling to consider any cuts to any entitlement program. But we're now faced with a scenario in which both sides of the aisle can understand that our perpetual deficit spending habit places in jeopardy every single aspect of the operations of the federal government. Just to paint one scenario, I'd like to point out that the budget projections produced by the White House just a couple of weeks ago predicted, based on a fairly optimistic set of projections, that over the next 10 years we'll acquire enough new debt that when added to our existing debt will cause us to be spending almost $1 trillion every single year just on interest on our national debt. To put that in perspective, $1 trillion is more than we currently spend on Social Security in an entire year. It's more than we currently spend on Medicare and Medicaid combined in an entire year. And it's significantly more than we spend on national defense in any year. And this $1 trillion number is one that could actually be much larger if some of these projections turn out not to be correct. We now face a moment when both liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats, regardless of what they most want to protect in their federal government, have to realize that what they most want to protect is placed in grave jeopardy by our current spending practices. I'm troubled by the fact that as we approach a debate surrounding a continuing resolution, this week a continuing resolution is likely to operate for just a few weeks to keep the government funded. We're still talking about adding on an annualized basis to our national debt at a rate exceeding $1.5 trillion a year. I think the American people deserve better. I know that they demand better. And some of the things that we saw in the 2010 election cycle portend something much greater for what we're going to see in the 2012 election cycle. The polls support the fact that what we can see from the 2010 election cycle is that Americans want Congress to balance its budget, and they want us to do something about it more than just talking about it. They want us to put ourselves in a straitjacket. Benjamin Franklin used to say, he'll cheat without scruple who can without fear. I think the congressional corollary to that might be that Congress, which can continue to engage in perpetual deficit spending, will continue to do so unless or until it's held accountable by the people and unless or until the people require that Congress to put itself in a straitjacket. That's the straitjacket we need. And that's why I'm proposing this amendment, so that at a minimum, before this patent reform legislation, which I support wholeheartedly, moves forward, we can all agree as members of this body that we need a constitutional amendment to keep us from doing what is slowly killing the economy of the United States and gradually mounting a severe challenge, an existential threat to every federal program that currently exists. I invite each of my colleagues to vote for, to support this amendment, and to support Senate Joint Resolution 5, a constitutional amendment that I have proposed that would put Congress in this type of straitjacket. Here's in essence what SJR 5 says. If adopted by Congress by the requisite two-thirds margins in both houses and approved by the states, three-fourths of them as required by Article 5 of the Constitution, it would tell Congress that it may not spend more than it receives in a given year, that it may not spend more than 18% of GDP in a year, that it may not raise taxes, and that it may not raise the national debt ceiling without a two-thirds supermajority vote in both houses of Congress. That's the kind of permanent, binding constitutional measure that I think we need in order to protect the government programs that we value so highly and upon which 300 million Americans have come to depend in one way or another. I urge each of my colleagues to support this amendment and to support Senate Joint Resolution 5. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Without objection, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
President.
Senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, I rise today to speak on the Patent Reform Act of 2011, the pending legislation before us, which I understand will be retitled America Invests Act. When this bill was marked up in the Judiciary Committee in 2007 and again in 2009, I voted against it, and I submitted minority views to the committee report for the bill. In the 2009 committee report, Senators Russ Feingold and Tom Coburn joined me in identifying a set of issues that we felt needed to be addressed before the bill was ready for consideration by the full Senate. Chief among these were concerns about the bill's system of post-issuance administrative review of patents. Now, that's a mouthful, but for most folks, what that basically means is after you've had the patent issued, how do you go back and review its legality? Senior career staff at the Patent Office had expressed deep misgivings about the office's ability to administer this system. In response, at the conclusion of the 2009 markup, Chairman Leahy pledged to invite the Patent Office to work with the committee to address these concerns and to try to develop a system that the office would be able to administer. Well, Chairman Leahy carried through on that pledge, held those meetings later that year. And as a result, important changes were made to the bill, eventually resulting in a manager's amendment that was announced in 2010 by Chairman Leahy and then-ranking member Sessions. The 2010 manager's amendment, which is also the basis of the present bill, substantially addressed all of the concerns that Senators Feingold and Coburn and I had raised in the 2009 minority report. And as a result, I became a co-sponsor of that amendment, and I'm proud to co-sponsor and support the bill that is before us today. I'll take just a few moments to describe the key changes that led to the 2010 breakthrough on this bill. But first, I'd like to address an important aspect of the bill that's recently become the subject of some controversy. This is the bill's change to a first inventor to file patent system. And that's a pretty big deal, a pretty big change. About two-thirds of the present bill has never been controversial and has been included in all of the various iterations of the bill since the first patent reform bill was introduced in 2005 by Representative Lamar Smith, who was then chairman of the House Intellectual Property Subcommittee. Representative Smith's 2005 bill, which was H.R. 2795, included the following proposals. It switched the United States from a first-to-invent patent system to a first-inventor-to-file system. The Smith bill enacted Chapter 32 of Title 35, creating a first-window post-grant opposition procedure. It authorized third parties to submit and explain relevant prior art to the Patent Office with respect to an application before a patent is issued. The Smith bill amended the innovator's oath and expanded the rights of assignees to prosecute a patent application under Section 112. And it also eliminated subjective elements from the patent code and included the first proposal for creating derivation proceedings. All of these elements of Representative Smith's original 2005 bill are retained in the bill that is before us today and are, in fact, the most important parts of the bill. And until recently, they had not proven controversial. After the announcement of the 2010 manager's amendment, however, members of the Judiciary Committee began to hear more from critics of the bill's move to a first-to-file system. Under the current law's first-to-invent system, a patent applicant or owner has priority against other patents or applications or against invalidating prior art if he conceived of his invention before the other inventor conceived of his invention or before the prior art was disclosed. Under the first-to-file system, by contrast, the same priority is determined by when the application for patent was filed. Whichever inventor files first has priority, and third-party prior art is measured against the filing date and is invalidating if it disclosed the invention before the date when the application was filed, rather than the date when the invention was conceived. In commentary that was published on Sunday, February 27th, Mr. Gene Quinn, the writer of the IP Watchdog website, made some worthy points about the bill's proposed move to the first-to-file system. Responding to critics of first-to-file, Mr. Quinn first noted that, in practical effect, We already have a first inventor to file system. For example, since the start of fiscal year 2005, on October 1, 2004, there have been over 2.9 million patent applications filed and only 502 interferences decided. An interference proceeding occurs when multiple inventors file an application claiming the same invention and is the hallmark of a first-to-invent system. On top of the paltry 502 interferences over nearly 7 years, a grand total of 1 independent inventor managed to demonstrate that they were the first to invent, and a grand total of 35 small entities were involved in an interference. In other words, as Mr. Quinn notes, although the first-to-invent system is supposed to help the little guy, over the last 7 years, only 1 independent inventor has managed to win an interference contest and secure the benefits of the first-to-invent system. And again, this is out of nearly 3 million patent applications filed over this period. So Mr. Quinn's comments debunk the notion that an interference proceeding is a viable means of securing first-to-invent rights for independent and other small inventors. I keep using the wrong word there, Mr. President. He makes some other points in this regard that I want to include in my formal remarks, which I'll ask to be fully included at the conclusion of what I have to say here. Part of the resolution of all of these issues is the fact that all of the people who have an interest in the patent reform system have now had more than 2 years to come forth, air their complaints and concerns, work with Chairman Leahy, with Representative Smith, with the Patent Office. As recently as last week, Chairman Leahy had representatives of the Patent Office meet with Senator Schumer and myself on yet another issue. And as a result of this myriad of meetings and negotiation and really revelations about how the patent system really works, we've been able to make changes that have been incorporated into a manager's amendment or a substitute if that's what's required. And I think the result is that there will be many people who had questions or concerns initially that will be quite happy with the result of the work of the committee. And so it's my hope that after the Senate has fully considered this legislation, that we will be able to pass it with a strong voice of support here in the Senate, where then we can work with our House colleagues and try for the first time in many, many years to reform what really is the foundation for America's success. We are a people who are involved in inventing things, and people around the world copy what we do. But our great strength is our ability to invent. We have to have a rule of law that codifies those inventions and that enables protection of the law for people who have invented them so that the investments that have been made can be returned to the people who did the inventing and investing. And I think in this patent bill we have achieved that sort of sweet spot, as it were, with yet thousands of interests weighing in on different aspects of this. So, Mr. President, I'll ask unanimous consent that at the point that I finished making my comments, the remainder of my remarks be inserted in the record as if read, and would urge my colleagues to fully participate in this debate, come to the floor with any questions or comments that they have, and that at the end of this process, Chairman Leahy will finally be rewarded with a bill that will bear his imprimatur and support a bill that will be extraordinarily important to the future well-being of the people of the United States of America.
Mr. President, the Senator would yield. The Senator has been involved in this right from the beginning. We have worked in having a bill that should be in the best interest of the Senate, one where both Republicans and Democrats across the political spectrum work very closely together. We run the risk of countries in Asia and Europe out-innovating the United States, and that we, patent systems, other countries are well ahead of us. And I do. And we want to have the best tools to compete. I believe Americans can compete with any country in the world, but they should at least have the tools to do it and be able to play on it becomes almost a cliche, but we have to play on a level playing field, and this will allow us to do that. But I compliment the Senator from Arizona for the way he has worked on this and his constant efforts, both in the committee, the public meetings, but that's the tip of the iceberg. It's the hundreds of hours of behind-the-scenes working to reach where we are. So I would hope sometime in the next few minutes or so we can at least get a vote on the manager's package and then get going with the bill, because this is something that can be voted on, can be passed. We've been working, as the Senator from Arizona knows, we've been working very closely with our counterparts in the other body. And I know that Chairman Smith would like to move quickly. We can have a bill in the President's desk in a relatively short time. So I thank the Senator for his kind words.
Madam President, I thank the Chairman of the committee.
Without objection, the Senator from Arizona's statement will be printed in the record.
Madam President.
The Senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I ask regular order on the Vitter amendment.
The amendment is now pending.
And Madam President.
Madam President, I thought the amendment pending is the manager's amendment.
The Senator has just called for the regular order with respect to his amendment.
And Madam President, I now send the
Senator from
modification
Louisiana.
to the desk.
The amendment is so modified.
Thank you, Madam President. I'll be happy to explain. We've been in contact with the distinguished chairman and his staff. This modification simply merges what was previously a separate Toomey amendment and a separate Vitter amendment. We had hoped to have votes on those as a first-degree and a second-degree amendment. That wasn't possible, so this is a merged amendment. Let me explain what that amendment does. The basis of this amendment is Senator Toomey's Full Faith and Credit Act, and it's very important, and it simply says if we ever as a country reach our debt ceiling, then even if we go beyond the debt ceiling, we will use all the tools available to the Treasury Secretary to continue for as long as possible to pay, to make good on U.S. debt. We're not going to immediately default on U.S. debt. Madam President, there's been a lot of scare tactics, in my opinion, suggesting that if we ever reach that day of bumping up against our statutory debt ceiling, the very next day, the very next hour, the U.S. would default on its debt, not make good on our obligations of the U.S. Treasury. That isn't true. It doesn't have to be true, and this important reform will ensure that it's not true. We get far more revenue into the U.S. Treasury than has to be spent simply to service the debt. So the underlying Toomey bill, which is the heart of this amendment, says we will make good on those obligations. They will be the top priority. The original Vitter amendment, which is now merged together with the Toomey amendment, says the exact same thing with regard to Social Security payments. Madam President, I'm sure we would all agree that seniors on fixed incomes depend on their Social Security checks. So the Vitter part of this now merged Toomey-Vitter amendment says that we will honor Social Security payments in the same status as debt payments, and we will use federal revenues first for those purposes before we do anything else. And what that means, Madam President, if we ever do bump up on the debt ceiling, we would not stop Social Security checks the next day. We would not stop Social Security checks the next month. We could go many weeks, probably a few months, honoring all of those commitments in the areas of Social Security and debt on U.S. Treasury notes. So that is the purpose of this now merged Toomey-Vitter amendment. We're not suggesting that it's necessarily a good idea to bump up on the debt ceiling. We're just saying let's all take a deep breath. Let's not use scare tactics. Let's not use hysteria. Let's plan ahead. What we hope will be the outcome is that we will not only deal with the debt ceiling in a responsible way, but before that we'll also deal with our underlying fiscal crisis in a responsible way. We'll make real and serious budget reforms to get on a fiscally sustainable path, which we're clearly not on right now. Just this morning, Senator Toomey and I were in the Banking Committee hearing where Chairman Ben Bernanke of the Federal Reserve testified. And Chairman Bernanke said again, as he has numerous times over the last year and more, that the fiscal path we're on as a federal government is completely unsustainable. That is he also said that is the single biggest long-term threat to our economy. And he also said, while it is a long-term problem, it could manifest itself in serious negative consequences in the short term. So this could rattle our economy and even begin to create an economic crisis, who knows when, possibly in the short term. So the clock is ticking, and we need serious budget reform. And this combined Toomey-Vitter amendment would, I think, take the hysteria out of the discussion and hopefully urge us to take concrete action on that serious budget reform before it's too late. With that, Madam President, I'd like to yield to my distinguished colleague.
Senator does that. Would he yield for a question?
I'll be happy to yield first.
You're talking about 112, which you modified. Does that mean you're withdrawing 113?
Yes, we will be seeking a single vote on the amendment as modified.
So, am I correct that 113 is withdrawn?
It is not withdrawn at this time.
Well, first of all, as I understand it, it has been modified. So it has become...
12. You modified 112. I didn't know what you want to do with 113.
If I could yield to my colleague from Pennsylvania, I think he can help answer the question. But to clarify from my point of view, we are seeking a vote, a single vote, which I think we're very close to locking in, on the new modified amendment, which is a combination of the separate Vitter and Toomey amendments.
And thank you for yielding. I would just say that as soon as we can work out the specifics with the staff, that's exactly the intention that Senator Vitter and I came to. So a single vote on the merger of two amendments. And I would just take a moment to thank Senator Vitter for his help on this. Madam President, Senator Vitter was kind enough to offer the text of my legislation as an amendment to the patent reform bill. I think what he is adding by suggesting that the legislation should require the Treasury to prioritize not only the debt service so that we can avoid under all circumstances avoid a default by the United States government, but also make sure that Social Security payments get the priority they deserve. The fact is, in the, I think, unlikely and I would say certainly unfortunate event that we were to reach the debt limit without having raised it, the federal government would still take in more than enough revenue to pay all of the interest service on the debt and all Social Security benefits. It's entirely manageable from an operational, functional point of view. Total revenue to the government from tax purposes alone is on the order of 70% of all expected expenditures. Debt service is only about 6%. So I appreciate Senator Vitter's help on this, and by combining this, what we really do, if we can pass this legislation, which I hope we will, we can take off the table the specter of a default. We can take off the table the specter of any senior citizen not getting their Social Security payment, and what we can then do is really have an honest discussion about how are we going to reform a process that's gotten us into this fix, gotten us to the point where we're running a deficit of 10% of GDP, where our total debt is screaming towards totally unsustainable levels. I can tell you the folks in Pennsylvania know very well that you cannot continue living beyond your means as this government has been. I see this as a very constructive, important opportunity to begin to have this discussion about how we're going to get this process under control. So I appreciate the help from Senator Vitter, and I will yield back my time to him.
I thank my distinguished colleague, and again, this amendment as modified simply says that if we were ever to reach the statutory debt limit for the federal government, then revenue coming in would go first to service two things: Social Security checks and interest on the federal debt. So that would not be put in jeopardy for months down the line. And the purpose of this amendment is to try to take, quite frankly, again, Madam President, some of the scare tactics and some of the hysteria out of the debate, and to urge us to act. None of us want to bump up on the debt ceiling. None of us are advocating that. What we are advocating is to take action now, real, serious budget reform, to put us on a more fiscally sustainable path. We need to do that now. That's why we came to the floor with these concerns on the patent bill. We need to do that now. We need to act now. We need to get on a fiscally sustainable path now. The clock is ticking, as Chairman Bernanke reminded us before the Banking Committee this morning. With that, Madam President, I look forward to locking in a vote on this matter, and in the consent that establishes that, we will be happy to withdraw the other amendment and simply have one vote on the now combined Toomey-Vitter amendment. With that, Madam President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Madam President,
Senator from Oklahoma.
I'd ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I wish to thank the chairman of the committee for his work on this patent bill. I still have a few small problems with it, but I'm extremely grateful for his consideration of an amendment in terms of the fee diversion. What most people in America don't understand is there's no tax dollars taken from any general fund for the patent office. It's all fees that when you file a patent or file a trademark or file a copyright, you pay into the patent office. Unfortunately, over the last 10 or 15 years, $800 million of those dollars, of those fees, have not been left at the patent office. They've been taken and used somewhere else. So when you pay a fee for a patent, that money isn't going to pay for the examination of the patent. And so right now, we find ourselves with 718,000 patents waiting for first action. If I file a patent today, what we will see is 26 months from now, my patent will have first action, the first reading of an examiner of my patent application. And if we want to create jobs and we want to stay on top of the world in terms of innovation, we can't allow that process to continue. So what the amendment does is says we're not going to take the money that people used to pay for a patent application and spend it somewhere else. We're actually going to spend it on patent applications. That's what it was set up for. And quite frankly, it's immoral to take money for a specific purpose for advantaging an American company or inventor or university and not apply that money to the purpose it was intended under the statute. And although this is a controversial, most Americans would think that if you're paying $10 on a toll road, the money for the toll road is going to keep the toll road up. And yet we haven't been doing that with the Patent Office. And we're in trouble not because of just of our Patent Office, but we're also in trouble because we've not enforced intellectual property rights owned by Americans around the world. And so as we work on getting a patent bill and blending it with whatever the House passes, it's just as important, and I thank, again, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee because he was kind enough to have a hearing on intellectual property for us in terms of its enforcement. So there's two key points for American innovation to bring jobs to America. One is when you get a good idea, having the ability to get it patented and defend the patent. And the other side of that is to enforce that patent throughout the world with our own Justice Department and in terms of our State Department in terms of intellectual property rights. It's amazing that how much of our intellectual property is being stolen by China today. And I want to relate to you a conversation I had with the Secretary of Commerce, equivalent to our Secretary of Commerce in China 3 years ago. When I asked him about intellectual property rights, he was very bold in his statement to say that we're not going to honor them. We're a developing nation and you wouldn't have honored them either, even though they're a signatory to the World Trade Organization. So it's important that we understand who we're dealing with, people that are going to cheat and steal intellectual property from America. So fixing the patent apparatus will help us get there, but it's just as important that we have tough laws on our books here that create sanctions on nations who do not honor intellectual property. So again, I would say this is a simple, straightforward, moral response to an immoral act that we've been doing, collecting fees for something and then not spending it on that, which has put us behind the curve. And this will bring us back. We have a wonderful new director over the last 18 months in our patent office. It's being run better than it's ever been run. They're catching up. But last year, we took $53 million of the fees that were for patents and spent it elsewhere. And what this amendment does is stop that. And it may come a time, in this bill we allow the patent office to set their fees. It'll come a time when we have to say, wait a minute, you guys, you're charging too much. You got to be more efficient. And so my hope is, and we don't do anything with oversight, we still have the oversight capabilities of all the appropriation committees. We still have the ability to change this in the future in terms of their fee setting. And if we do the proper oversight, what we will do is we will spring forward with tremendous new technology that is protected and enable that capital expenditure that was spent to get that technology to flourish in terms of American jobs. So again, I would say I thank the chairman. He worked with me judiciously on this. It's been a pleasure to work with him, and I thank him for his efforts on my behalf and that of the American inventors in this country.
Senator
from Vermont.
Senator Bejield, he raised some questions with me. We worked both in the committee and out of the committee with respect for each other's position. I appreciate his work in the committee to expedite getting the bill out of committee because, like he, I believe this is extraordinarily important to level the playing field and allow American innovators to be able to compete with the rest of the world as well as compete within our country. And so I compliment the senator, and as he knows, I've included his proposal in the manager's amendment because I thought it was a good proposal.
Yield the floor.
Senator from Vermont.
I ask unanimous consent that the time until 5 p.m. be for debate on the Leahy-Grassley Amendment number 121 as modified, which I believe is pending. And
It is one of the pending amendments.
Okay. I ask unanimous consent that the time until 5 p.m. be for debate on the Leahy-Grassley Amendment number 121 is modified, and the bidder for Toomey Amendment number 112 is modified in block and divided between the two leaders or their designees. That upon the use or yielding back of time, the Senate proceed to a vote in relation to the Leahy-Grassley Amendment number 121 is modified. That upon disposition of the Leahy-Grassley Amendment, the Senate vote in relation to the bidder for Toomey Amendment number 112 as modified. The motions to reconsider be considered made laid upon the table with no intervening action debate, and there be no amendments in order to any of the amendments listed in this agreement prior to the vote, and further that the bidder amendment number 113 is modified be withdrawn.
Without objection, so ordered.
President, I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
President, I ask consent the time be charged equally.
Without objection. The senator from Iowa.
I rise for the purpose of putting a statement for...
The Senate is in a quorum call.
Well, the lights aren't on up there, so there isn't a quorum call in. I can only go by what I see. There's no quorum call.
The clerk has called the name.
I ask consent to call the quorum be dispensed with.
Okay, thank you.
Without objection.
Madam President.
The senator from Iowa.
Thank you for your due diligence. I would like to rise for the purpose of putting a statement in the record for myself on the Coburn proposal to the PTO fee diversion. I'll send this.
Without objection.
Thank you. I ask for the calling of the quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The senator from Iowa.
I ask that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that a quorum call be equally charged to both sides.
Without objection.
Now I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander.
President.